The air inside the Long Beach Municipal Auditorium was thick with humidity and the heavy, suffocating weight of ego. It was August 2nd, 1964, and the International Karate Championships were underway. This was not a gathering of movie stars or casual hobbyists. This was a room filled with the hardest men on the planet. Black belts, grandmasters, and street fighters from across the globe had gathered to prove whose style was superior. Amidst the sea of heavy-set karatekas and towering heavyweights, a slight, wiry figure in a black gung fu uniform stepped onto the mat. He stood no taller than 5'7" and weighed barely 135 pounds. To the giants in the room, he looked less like a warrior and more like a dancer. As he began to speak, his voice was calm, almost philosophical, contrasting sharply with the testosterone-fueled atmosphere of the tournament. There were whispers in the crowd, cynical smirks exchanged between the old guard, and a palpable sense of dismissal. They saw a small man with big ideas, preaching about fluid motion and the rejection of rigid tradition. In their minds, power came from mass, from size, and from the deep, guttural shout of a karate kiai. They looked at Bruce Lee, and internally they laughed. They had no idea that in the next few minutes, everything they thought they understood about human combat was about to be violently deconstructed. Bruce Lee was not yet the global icon of cinema that history remembers. At this moment, he was a disruptor, a 23-year-old radical trying to drag the ancient world of martial arts into the 20th century. He had been invited by Ed Parker, the father of American Kenpo, to give a demonstration, but Lee had no intention of performing a rehearsed, flowery routine. He wanted to demonstrate the raw reality of physics applied to violence. He called for a volunteer. A man named Bob Baker, a skilled martial artist in his own right, stepped forward to assist. Baker was not a prop, he was a solid, resisting human being. He stood with his feet planted firmly, bracing himself for an impact he assumed he could absorb. Lee positioned himself directly in front of Baker, closing the distance until their bodies were almost touching. He raised his right fist, extending his fingers so they were loose and relaxed, hovering exactly 1 inch away from Baker's chest. The crowd fell silent, but the skepticism remained. From that distance, conventional wisdom dictated that it was impossible to generate any significant force. There was no room to wind up, no space to gather momentum, and no runway to build speed. It defied the laws of mechanics as the audience understood them. Then, without a telegraph, without a pullback, and without a warning breath, Bruce Lee moved. In a fraction of a second, faster than the shutter speed of the cameras present, Lee's fist closed and exploded forward. It wasn't just an arm movement, it was a kinetic chain reaction that started in the soles of his feet, shot up through his legs, twisted violently through his hips, and channeled out through his shoulder and fist. The impact was thunderous. Bob Baker didn't just stumble, he was launched backward as if he had been hit by a swinging sledgehammer. His feet left the ground and he flew back several feet before crashing into the chair placed behind him for safety, knocking it over and sliding across the floor. The auditorium erupted not with applause at first, but with a collective gasp of disbelief. The laughter died instantly. The smirks vanished. The room had just witnessed the impossible. What the audience had seen was the debut of the 1-inch punch, a technique that would become synonymous with Bruce Lee's legend. But the shock of the moment went far deeper than a mere parlor trick. It was a terrifying display of neuromuscular efficiency. To understand why this was so shocking, one has to look at the physics that Lee had mastered, concepts that sports science would take decades to fully catch up with. Most fighters of that era punched with their shoulders and arms, relying on the weight of their limbs to do damage. Lee had realized that true power comes from acceleration and mass integration. By synchronizing every muscle fiber in his body to fire at the exact same millisecond, he turned his 135-pound frame into a dense, solid projectile. The 1-inch was not a limitation, it was a statement. It proved that distance was irrelevant if your timing and structure were perfect. The aftermath of that punch was even more revealing than the strike itself. Bob Baker, the man who took the hit, would later go on record describing the experience. He didn't just feel a push, he felt a penetration of force that rattled his internal organs. He famously stated that he had to stay home from work the next day because the pain in his chest was so severe he could barely breathe. The punch hadn't just moved him, it had traumatized his body. This was the difference between pushing power and snapping power. Lee had delivered a hydrostatic shock to Baker's system, sending waves of energy through the fluid in his body. For the grandmasters watching in the audience, this was a terrifying realization. If a man this small could generate enough force to incapacitate a grown man from 1 inch away, what would happen if he hit you with a full swing? The mathematical implications were frightening. This demonstration at Long Beach served as the catalyst for a paradigm shift in the martial arts world. Before this moment, the prevailing dogma was that style, form, and tradition were the ultimate metrics of a fighter. If you held your hand in the correct chambered position, if you performed your kata with perfect grace, you were considered a master. Bruce Lee shattered that illusion with a single motion. He showed that effectiveness was the only truth. The 1-inch punch was the physical embodiment of his emerging philosophy, Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist. It was direct, it was simple, and it was non-classical. It stripped away the non-essential. There was no wind-up because a wind-up warns the opponent. There was no screaming because screaming wastes energy. There was only the result. The The shockwaves of that Sunday in 1964 reached Hollywood almost immediately. Sitting in the audience was Jay Sebring, a celebrity hairstylist who was stunned by Lee's charisma and lethal capability. Sebring would tell a producer named William Dozier about the amazing Chinaman, who moved like a cat and hit like a truck. This word of mouth eventually led to Lee's casting as Kato in The Green Hornet. It is no exaggeration to say that the one-inch punch launched his career. But the irony remains that while the world fell in love with Bruce Lee the movie star, they often overlooked Bruce Lee the scientist. He spent thousands of hours analyzing the mechanics of fencing and boxing, adapting the footwork of Muhammad Ali and the lunge of a fencer to create a delivery system for his power. He read Newton's laws of motion and studied anatomy books with the same intensity that monks studied scripture. The punch was not magic, it was the result of obsessive, rigorous intellectual labor applied to the human machine. Decades later, scientists have attempted to analyze the biomechanics of the one-inch punch using motion capture technology and electromyography. The results confirmed what the crowd at Long Beach felt viscerally. Brain scans of martial arts experts performing short-range strikes show structural differences in the white matter of the cerebellum, the part of the brain that controls motor coordination. This suggests that Bruce Lee's power came not just from strong muscles, but from a hyper-optimized brain that could synchronize movement with a precision that average humans simply do not possess. When he struck, he wasn't just using muscle. He was using a neural superhighway he had built through years of relentless repetition. The laughable idea that a small man could defeat a giant was proven to be a matter of neurological wiring and kinetic alignment. The legacy of that moment continues to challenge us today. In an era of flashy tricks and internet challenges, the one-inch punch stands as a testament to depth over superficiality. The masters who smirked at Lee represented the comfort of the status quo. They laughed because he didn't fit their mold. He didn't wear the right belt, he didn't use the traditional stances, and he spoke too much. But when the violence happened, reality took over. The shock that rippled through the auditorium was the sound of old beliefs shattering. It forced the martial arts community to ask uncomfortable questions about what actually works in a fight versus what simply looks good. Bruce Lee proved that the human body is capable of generating devastating energy without the need for excessive motion. He showed us that power is not about how big you are, but about how totally you can commit yourself to a single moment in time. When he closed his fist that day, he wasn't just punching a man, he was punching a hole through the limitations of human potential. The laughter stopped because the truth is undeniable. You can argue with a theory, you can debate a philosophy, and you can mock a style. But you cannot argue with a man who can stop your heart from an inch away. The shocking reality of Bruce Lee was never just his speed or his strength. It was his absolute, undeniable authenticity in a world full of pretenders. Would you like me to analyze another legendary martial arts moment or break down the training regimen Bruce Lee used to achieve this speed?